Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris. Now, The Silence of the Lambs is a crime drama / psychological horror novel published in 1988. And this is a sequel to Harris's 1981 novel Red Dragon, which before this had already been adapted into the 1986 film Manhunter by Michael Mann. Now, Silence of the Lambs would later be adapted into the 1991 Jonathan Demme film of the same name. Now, both Red Dragon and The Silence of the Lambs and their subsequent movie adaptations would introduce the character of Hannibal Lecter, who would go on to become one of the most iconic villains in literature and film, even though his role in these two stories is relatively small. Now, I'll talk more about the film adaptation of Silence of the Lambs, as well as the other Hannibal Lecter books and movies later on in this video. Now, I did review Red Dragon several months ago, and I'll leave a link in the description below to where you can check out that review. And I actually did review Silence of the Lambs way back in 2015. That review is still up, however it's no longer public. It's now marked as unlisted, but you could still see it with a link, and I'll leave a link in the description below to where you can check out my 2015 review of Thomas Harris's Silence of the Lambs. Now, before the publication of his first novel, Black Sunday, which has no connection with the Hannibal series, Thomas Harris was a police journalist covering actual crime scenes for the Waco Tribune-Herald. And for research, he attended classes and spoke with FBI agents at the FBI Behavioral Science Unit in Quantico, Virginia. And some of Red Dragon, particularly the characters of Will Graham and Jack Crawford, were partially inspired by real-life criminal profiler John E. Douglas, who was one of the first criminal profilers for the FBI. Now, I believe some of the plot of Silence of the Lambs was actually partially inspired by the FBI using Ted Bundy to help them catch the Green River Killer. So, the plot of The Silence of the Lambs is it's set a few years after the events of Red Dragon. Jack Crawford, who is a major character in Red Dragon, who in the novel's universe is the head of the Behavioral Science Unit for the FBI, he sends in a young FBI trainee named Clarice Starling to interview incarcerated serial killer Hannibal Lecter, who is a psychiatrist who is both killing and cannibalizing his victims, many of whom turned out to be his own patients, and Lecter was eventually captured by Crawford's protege, Will Graham. Now, Clarice is sent to interview him under the pretense of building a psychological profile on Lecter, when in reality, Crawford is actually trying to see if Lecter has any information on a serial killer that they're currently looking for that the FBI and the press have nicknamed Buffalo Bill, who has been abducting and murdering young women, all of whom were found later on partially skinned. And the hunt for Buffalo Bill intensifies when he abducts the daughter of a senator. Eventually, Lecter lets on that he knows who Buffalo Bill is, and he starts feeding Clarice information on Buffalo Bill, as well as clues on how she could catch him. But in exchange, Clarice has to give Lecter personal information about herself, because throughout the novel, Hannibal and Clarice develop a very bizarre and very complex relationship where it becomes clear that while Lecter is sort of toying with Clarice, he also does seem to have a respect for her as well. But in order to heal some past traumas, Clarice now becomes determined to find Buffalo Bill and stop him before he murders this young woman. But during all of this, it becomes clear that Lecter kinda has an agenda all his own. Now, The Silence of the Lambs is that rare example of a sequel that actually outshines its predecessor. In a lot of ways, this is a better book than Red Dragon, and it arguably is the best book in the entire Hannibal Lecter saga. And it's easily the most famous and recognizable title in the series, and a lot of people don't even realize that this is actually a sequel. And also, you do do not have to read Red Dragon in order to understand this. It does make direct references to the events of Red Dragon, and there are returning characters like, obviously, Hannibal Lecter, Jack Crawford, and Dr. Chilton, and there are direct references to Will Graham and Francis Dollarhide, as well as a minor character from Red Dragon named Allan Bloom. But the story of Silence of the Lambs is self-contained enough where you really don't have to read Red Dragon, but if you have read the first book, that makes all the references and Easter eggs to the first novel stand out even more. Like, in a lot of ways, this almost feels like an improvement upon the universe and the formula that Thomas Harris established with Red Dragon, yet it doesn't take away from that novel either. In fact, it sort of adds to it, I think. And what's interesting is if you strip both novels down to their basic plot lines, when you think about it, Red Dragon and Silence of the Lambs are almost the same plot, yet it doesn't feel like Thomas Harris is repeating himself with this novel. Like, Silence of the Lambs still very much feels like its own story. Like, Thomas Harris could have easily have made Clarice Starling just a female version of Will Graham, but he doesn't do that. She is very much her own character, and is a great character too. There's a reason a lot of feminist critics look to Clarice as a great example of a strong but also well-written and believable female protagonist in a story like this. Now, the book definitely has a feminist undercurrent. I will say I think the movie played up the feminist themes a little bit more, but they certainly are present in the novel. Like, throughout the novel, people are constantly second-guessing Clarice, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that she is only a trainee, but while nobody comes out and says it, there is an undercurrent of sexism as well. And throughout the novel, Clarice has to constantly prove herself and overcome not just her inexperience, but the perceived limitations of her gender as well. And you get some of that with how Dr. Chilton, who runs the psychiatric hospital where Lecter is incarcerated, how he talks to her. And Chilton is such a slime bag. He was an asshole in Red Dragon as well, but in this, you just want to punch this guy in the throat. Like, he's just so arrogant and so swarmy. Like, I hated this guy. I hated him more than Lecter, and Lecter is a fucking serial killer. And Chilton, he's the one who almost is openly sexist towards Clarice. Like, at one point in the beginning, when Clarice first meets him, Chilton's like, oh, Crawford is smart for using you, and she's like, what do you mean? And basically Chilton says, well, Lecter won't talk to anybody else, but, oh, if we send in a hot young woman to talk to Lecter and turn him on, maybe we'll get something out of him. Chilton doesn't say it quite as crassly as that, but that is more or less what he says to Starling. Like, the fact that she's a woman is all that Chilton can think about. Like, it never clicks with him that Clarice might actually be really competent and might actually be qualified for this job. And at one point, they get close to Lecter cooperating with them and actually giving them Buffalo Bill's name, but Chilton just fucks that up loyally because he's that much of a douchebag. There's also a point in the story where they find the body of one of Buffalo Bill's victims, and it's at a funeral home, so Crawford and Clarice go to analyze the body. That's the scene where they find the insect cocoon, which turns out to be a death's head moth that Buffalo Bill has placed in the throat of this young woman. But before that, Crawford goes to the sheriff because the funeral home is crawling with cops, and Crawford goes to the sheriff of this town saying, Sheriff, I don't think it's appropriate to be discussing a crime like this in front of a woman. And then there's a moment later on where Jack Crawford turns to Clarice and says, Starling, when I said that to the sheriff back at the funeral home, that really burned you, didn't it? And Starling honestly says, yes, it did. But then Crawford says that was just smoke. He basically says he was just trying to get the sheriff and the other police officers out of their hair, but then Starling calls him on it and says, "It matters." Basically, she says that as an FBI agent, he should be setting an example for these small-town cops in terms of how to treat a female colleague. But it also matters in the sense that even though Crawford is technically her boss, she went there to do a job that her gender should have nothing to do with. So again, there is this undercurrent of this woman having to prove herself in this male-dominated field. And Buffalo Bill literally views these young women that he kidnaps as objects for him to tear apart. And Clarice becomes determined to save this young woman who is abducted, Catherine Martin, not just to prove herself in the FBI, but also because she starts to realize this is a young woman, not much younger than me, who is in this horrific situation. She starts to kind of see a bit of a kinship with Catherine Martin, or sort of starts to see a bit of herself in Catherine. So again, the book definitely has this feminist undercurrent and this theme about how women are viewed and treated in our society. So throughout most of the story, Clarice has to deal with the more casual kind of sexism that, unfortunately, women in our society still have to deal with. And then Buffalo Bill, despite ironically wanting to become a woman, he represents the most extreme form of misogyny where these female victims are not even people to him. The book also has a theme of power and power dynamics. We don't get a lot of Buffalo Bill, James Gunn's backstory in the book. I mean, we get a little bit of it towards the end of the novel, but we certainly don't get as much of his backstory as we do with, like, Francis Dollarhide in Red Dragon. But it is implied that James Gunn had a very abusive upbringing, and he probably didn't have a lot of power growing up, so what he's doing to these young women as an adult is sort of his way of exerting the power that he felt was taken away from him as a child. We see Dr. Chilton abusing his power with how he torments Dr. Lecter, and yeah, Lecter was a bad guy, but as a doctor, you shouldn't be tormenting or abusing a patient in your care, regardless of what they've done. But we also see the themes of power dynamics with how Chilton is sort of interfering with this investigation, trying to exert his power and his authority over this investigation. And we also get that with Clarice, where we see the other law enforcement in the book trying to exert their power and authority over her when she, quote-unquote, steps out of line. So again, power dynamics is another theme in the novel, and the character work in the novel is great. Like I said, Clarice is an amazing protagonist. I feel like a lesser writer than Thomas Harris would have leaned into certain female stereotypes, or would have tried to overly sexualize her, or would have tried to make her too masculine. And Harris doesn't do that. Like, he actually does make her feel like a real person. And she is a likable character, but she also doesn't take shit from people either. You also have Jack Crawford coming back in this, and I actually feel like we get a lot more characterization with him in this than we did in Red Dragon. And the thing I do really like about Crawford is, despite that comment he made at the funeral home, he is on Clarice's side 100% throughout this book, and he has her back throughout the entire story. Like, he never questions her competence or her abilities, and the two of them actually had a really good relationship in this story. I hesitate to call it like a father-daughter relationship, but there is a side to Jack Crawford that does almost seem to be a little protective of Clarice, but not in a way where, like, he undermines her, or again undermines her abilities, or questions her, but I feel like he is almost slightly protective of her, and I actually think some of that has to do with what happened with Will Graham. Like in Red Dragon, Crawford really did push Will Graham into working on the Francis Dollarhide case, and things did not exactly end well for him, and it's also implied in this that things didn't really go well for Will Graham following the events of Red Dragon, and you get a sense sense that Crawford might partially blame himself for what happened to Will. Now, like I said, you don't have to read Red Dragon in order to understand this, but if you do read Red Dragon, that gives certain things that happen in this book a bit of a deeper meaning. Now, in the book, there's a subplot about Jack Crawford's wife dying of cancer, and a lot of those passages are so heartbreaking and so emotionally moving, but you get a sense that what's happening with his wife might also have something to do with his sort of protectiveness over Clarice. But again, while there is sort of this protective nature with Jack Crawford, when it comes to Clarice, he doesn't get in the way of her doing her job. Now, of course, Hannibal Lecter has a much bigger part to play in this novel than he did in Red Dragon, because if you've read Red Dragon, he is a very minor character in that first book, and only shows up in, I want to say, like 3 scenes in the first novel, and Thomas Harris has even admitted that he never really intended on bringing Lecter back in his later books, but in this, he makes Hannibal a much more central character in the story. And the whole dynamic between Hannibal and Clarice is fascinating, where he is genuinely creepy towards her and asks her some really creepy, off-putting questions, and at points he's actually very rude towards her. At the same time, he does seem to have a genuine respect for Clarice, and at points, he's almost more honest with her than any of the other characters in this book. And the two of them develop, I can't say a friendship per se, but a very interesting dynamic, and they both seem to have a certain kind of respect for each other. And Lecter is still very much a monster in this story. He's still a despicable human being, yet the book does show that he has a bit of a moral code, which of course the later Hannibal novels would play on even more. Another interesting character in the book, and he's a very minor character, but you have the character of Barney Matthews, I think Matthews is his last name, who is the head nurse or orderly in the psychiatric ward for the criminally insane that Dr. Chilton runs, and he seems to be the only staff member in this hospital that Lecter actually respects, because he treats Lecter well. That being said, he also never underestimates Lecter either, and he knows how to handle him. And there's a certain point in the story where Chilton gets in contact with Senator Ruth Martin, who is Catherine Martin's mother, and basically they make a deal with Lecter where if he gives them Buffalo Bill's real name, they'll transfer him to another facility where he'll get more privileges. And after Lecter is transferred out of there, Barney even says to Dr. Chilton, "I hope they know what they're doing, and I hope they know how to handle him." Spoiler, they don't, and they underestimate Lecter, and it ends up costing them dearly. And there's a part of the book where Hannibal and Barney actually have kind of a moment where Hannibal says to Barney, "You are always good to me. Thank you." And I actually thought that was a relatively sweet moment in the story, and in a way that makes it more disturbing because we can't forget all the horrible things that Lecter did. Like, the book actually gets us to kinda like Hannibal Lecter, even though he is a sadistic serial killer. But again, I really did like the Barney Matthews character, and I don't think any of the movies really did this character justice. Now, when talking about the main antagonist of the book, Buffalo Bill, it's impossible not to also talk about some of the main criticisms against this story and certain aspects of this novel that really have not aged that well, and by today's standards are a little problematic, and I generally hate using that term. And the book has been accused of transphobia because Buffalo Bill, the main villain, we eventually find out is actually a man named Jane Gum, a man who wants to be a woman. Now, despite this, the book actually goes out of its way to state that Buffalo Bill, or Jane Gum, is not actually transgender or transsexual as they called it back then. I'm not really sure if that term is politically correct today. Like, the book explains that because of years of systematic systemic abuse, James Gumb has come to hate his own identity so much that he wants to become anything than what he is. In this case, he wants to become a woman, and he's literally making a suit out of the skin of his victims to pursue this fantasy of him becoming a woman. But again, he's not actually transgender, at least that's the way the book explains it. But again, like, the explanation that Hannibal gives in the book, I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist, but it feels almost a little flimsy, and I hate to say it, that whole idea of somebody, like, not being transgender but thinking they are, I feel like that's what a lot of transphobic people, that's an argument that a lot of transphobic people today use to sort of justify their transphobia. I will say I don't personally believe Thomas Harris was intentionally being transphobic, but I also acknowledge that that's easy for me to say as a heterosexual, cisgendered male. And there is a scene in the book where Crawford goes to one of the hospitals that offers gender reassignment surgery, and he tries to get, like, the records or files on people that the hospital turned down for the surgery, and the guy who runs the clinic or runs the facility is like, no, I'm not gonna do that. These people have rights. These people have a right to privacy, and these are perfectly normal people. And I thought that was a really important scene in the book. Yes, that doctor is sort of getting in the way of the investigation, but he's kind of doing it for the right reasons. What does make that scene slightly problematic is that same doctor does kind of refer to transgenderism or transsexualism as a mental illness, which I certainly don't think it is, but I hate to say it, I think Thomas Harris might have just been going on what mainstream psychiatry said about it at the time, because I'm sure a lot has changed since then, and I hate to say it, some of this book is a product of its time. Eventually they do relent, and they give the FBI the files on James Gumb, but the person who runs this facility does say to Jack Crawford, please understand that this individual's actions do not represent the entire transgender community, or transsexual is the word they use, but I'm not sure if that word is really the correct term nowadays. Again, it's an aspect of the story that is not necessarily aged very well, but I don't personally believe Thomas Harris was intentionally being transphobic. But I do think it's possible that he might have been somewhat ignorant on the subject too. Again, there's a lot of aspects of this book that are definitely a product of their time. But again, because I'm not transgender, I'm not sure if I'm even completely qualified to really talk about this. But putting all that aside for a second, I do think The Silence of the Lambs is an excellent psychological thriller, and even though I do recommend Red Dragon, and I do recommend the entire series as a whole, you could easily read Silence of the Lambs as a self-contained story, and I do think it is technically the best book in the series. Now, before I talk about the movie Silence of the Lambs, I want to cut to two friends of mine, Allan Gunnells and Christian Feliciano, both of whom are frequent guests in my videos, giving their thoughts on this classic novel.
Hello out there, Allan Gunnells here. My friend Christian asked me to do a short review on the novel Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris, so I'm going to do so. Silence of the Lambs is actually one of my favorite suspense novels. I think it works wonderfully. It came out in 1988. I read it after the film adaptation came out in 1991, but I actually read the book first because the movie came out, it looked phenomenal, I wanted to see it, but I had already entered that phase of my life where if a movie came out I wanted to see and I found out it was based on a book, I wanted to read the book first. Back then I was a poor high school student, didn't have any money, so I actually ran out to the library and checked this out, and I devoured it. I think it is a fascinating book. The storyline is so gripping. Buffalo Bill is a terrifying serial killer. And Hannibal Lecter, of course, really became the star of this book, even though he's in it, a relatively short amount of time, but he makes an impact. He is this wonderful blend of sophistication and sinister evil. But what I really thought set this book apart was that while the villain was fascinating, so was the hero. Clarice Starling, I thought, was a wonderful character. Well up to the task of sort of, putting her wit against Hannibal Lecter's. And I like that they're actually, instead of just being an antagonist relationship, there was actually some respect between those two characters. There is a part where Hannibal says to Clarice, I think it would be quite something to know you in private life. And when I read that, I really felt it, because I'm like, she is, in her own right, a wonderful, fascinating character. And I loved the development of their relationship, but also the development of her character. She had a great backstory, great motivation. She felt very real, and definitely up to the task of not only going up against Hannibal Lecter, but also going up against Buffalo Bill, the serial killer in this one. So, like I said, one of my absolute favorite suspense novels, and I highly recommend it.
Going into Silence of the Lambs, you may think to yourself, well, I've already watched the movie, what's the point of reading the book? Trust me, reading the book is just so much better than the movie. Now, don't get me wrong, the movie is great, it's fantastic, but I do have to say, in all honesty, that Anthony Hopkins, as great of an actor as he is, and he deserves all the props he gets for playing Hannibal Lecter. I think he did great in the movie. However, he comes off very, very campy, cartoony, over the top, and in a story like Silence of the Lambs that's very grounded in, I don't know if I should say reality, but just it's very grounded. You should have everybody acting like that. Everybody should be grounded. And unfortunately, Anthony Hopkins is not in that movie. Hannibal Lecter is way over the top. He's like a supervillain at that point. And I would prefer if he was more subtle, like in the books. Now, in the books, don't get me wrong. You're looking at a serial killer. It's obvious, and then it's not obvious, because there's times where he's just very manipulative, and you kind of like him. There's things that he says that you find fascinating, and you kind of start to want to trust him, but then you realize, oh, wait a minute, he's a serial killer. We can't really trust him. He's very unreliable. And the way Clarice sees him, that's pretty much what you're gonna get, and I like that about the books, the book so much. Now, I do wish there was less of Lecter, like it was in Red Dragon. I prefer Red Dragon just because, first of all, I like the story more, but also I like the fact that Lecter is in it less. I like the idea that less is more, to bring up an old cliche. You want more of Lecter. You want to see more. And the fact that you get less of him, but yet he's still kind of pulling some strings behind the scenes, is just fascinating. That makes me love Red Dragon way more than Silence of the Lambs. However, it's not necessarily a bad thing. That's just more a personal thing on my part. And that's probably the only negative thing I'll say about Silence of the Lambs, is that I just wish there was less of Lecter, like it was in Red Dragon. But I will say he is written fantastically, and Clarice is an amazing character. I love that she's, she's new to this kind of, and she does have traumas in her past, not to spoil anything. But I do like their interactions with each other. I do like them hunting Buffalo Bill. I do like the character of Buffalo Bill. I think he's a very creepy character. And I like that they point out in the book that Buffalo Bill, believes that he is transgender. Not that he is transgender. And I like that they're being honest. I like that Thomas Harris is being honest throughout the entire book. There's never a point where you go, oh, he's just trying to make sure that he doesn't offend anybody. I like that he's being honest about stuff. But at the same time, I like that he's pointing out that Buffalo Bill is not transgender. He believes he is transgender, and that's part of his illness that's causing him to do what he's doing in the book, which is skinning women and wanting to put their skin on. Like Ed Gein, who he was inspired by. I just like that distinction. I like that Thomas Harris made that point. I think that was very smart. And, and of course, if you're me, you have no problem with transgender people. So I'm glad that they didn't try to make it like, oh, he's transgender, so therefore he's sick. No, they make it that there's a clear difference there. Not to get into morality and politics and such, but Yeah, I think the book overall is fantastic. It's written very well. It's very creepy. This is a horror book. I know that there's, it's detective fiction. It's also a thriller, but I will say that it is a horror book, and there is very dark stuff in this book. Kids should definitely avoid it. Anybody who's a queasy should definitely avoid this, unless you've seen other stuff similar to this, and you can take a little bit of violence, you can take a little bit of gore and stuff. Then I would suggest you read this. But if you're not into that kind of story, I would definitely avoid it. And I think the pacing is great. I think you can get through this book really fast. I tend to do it. I've read it a few times already, and I love Silence of the Lambs, and I get through it pretty quickly. I highly recommend everybody check it out. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Now, as I said earlier in this video, before Silence of the Lambs was even published, the first novel, Red Dragon, had already been adapted into the 1986 film Manhunter, directed by Michael Mann, and I love Manhunter. It's actually one of my top 10 favorite films of all time, but unfortunately it was not appreciated at the time. It has garnered a cult following over the years, and now it's actually a pretty highly regarded film, but at the time it was actually considered to be a notorious flop, and it got very mixed reviews from critics. For that reason, after Thomas Harris published The Silence of the Lambs, Orion Pictures secured the rights, but they were actually very hesitant to go through with the adaptation because of its association with Manhunter. That and the subject matter of the book, a lot of people were really afraid to touch it, like, a lot of people thought it was too disturbing for a mainstream film. But one of the people who really got the ball rolling on a Silence of the Lambs adaptation was actually Gene Hackman. Gene Hackman had apparently really wanted to direct a movie based on this book, and he had expressed interest in either playing Hannibal Lecter or Jack Crawford. Personally, I see Gene Hackman as Jack Crawford way more than I see him as Hannibal Lecter. But I heard Gene Hackman's daughter had read the book and found it to be too disturbing and asked her father not to do it. But we eventually did get a Silence of the Lambs movie in 1991 directed by Jonathan Demme, who would go on to direct Philadelphia, with a screenplay by Ted Talley. Now again, because Manhunter did not do that well, when they made Silence of the Lambs, they made it as a purely standalone film rather than a sequel to Manhunter, despite having returning characters like obviously Hannibal Lecter, Jack Crawford, and Dr. Chilton, but the movie omits all references to Will Graham and Francis Dolarhyde. Despite that, the film is remarkably faithful to the book, and any changes that it does make are really just superficial changes that do not really affect the story or change the story that much. But The Silence of the Lambs is a phenomenal, phenomenal movie. It's one of the best crime thrillers of the 1990s and of all time, really. And despite technically being a sequel to a movie that bombed, The Silence of the Lambs became this huge pop culture and cultural phenomenon, and to this day, it's still considered to be one of the greatest films of all time, and is arguably the most famous serial killer film of all time. And the film won multiple Academy Awards. It actually won in all 5 major categories at the Academy Awards, making it only the 3rd movie at the time to sweep the Oscars. And if you consider Silence of the Lambs a horror film, which people debate that, some people say it's more of a crime drama. I think it could count as both a crime drama and a horror film, but if you do consider it horror, it was also the first horror movie to sweep the Oscars. The film stars Jodie Foster as Clarice Starling. Definitely one of Foster's best performances, I think. She is amazing in this role, and she apparently really fought for the role too. She had read the book and really gravitated towards the Clarice Starling character, and I think originally Jonathan Demme wanted Michelle Pfeiffer to play Starling. Now, I have nothing against Michelle Pfeiffer, but I do not see her as Clarice. Not at all. Although another actress who I do think would have made a very interesting casting Clarice Starling. I don't know if she was ever considered for the role, but I could actually see Jennifer Jason Leigh as this character. But as it is, Jodie Foster does a phenomenal job in this movie, and she approaches the role with the right combination of strength and vulnerability, and the vulnerability comes less from her being a woman, although that does play a factor to a certain extent, and more just from her general inexperience. And she makes Clarice very likable and kinda quirky too, which I really liked. You also have Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter, who of course is iconic in the role. Now this character was originally played by Brian Cox in Manhunter, and I will say, and I might be committing sacrilege here, I do personally prefer Brian Cox, just because I think he played the role much more subtly and, in my opinion, more realistically, whereas Hopkins is a lot more theatrical as Lecter. That being said, it's still a great performance, and it really was Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of this character in Silence of the Lambs that made this character a pop culture icon. You also have Scott Glenn as Jack Crawford. Now this character was played by Dennis Farina in Manhunter. Now Farina is my go-to Jack Crawford. That being said, Scott Glenn does do a great job as well, and he plays the role very differently than Farina did, because again, this wasn't necessarily made to be a straight sequel to Manhunter. Now, the movie does cut out the subplot of Jack Crawford's wife dying of cancer, which made sense for the movie. While it was a very good subplot in the book and a very moving subplot, it wasn't necessarily needed for the film, and what works in a book won't always work well in a movie, so it made sense that they cut it. You also have Anthony Heald as Dr. Chilton. Now, this character was in Manhunter, where he's played by, I think the actor who played him in Manhunter is Benjamin Hendrickson, but you didn't really get to know him that well in Manhunter. In this, he is such a slimeball, and Anthony Heald really does capture that very well. You also have Ted Levine as James Gum, or Buffalo Bill, which is also an iconic performance in its own right. A little over the top, but it works. It really does. He is so creepy in this movie, but also darkly humorous as well. I also have a coworker who constantly quotes that line, "Wait a minute, was she a great big fat person?" And I gotta say, that scene where he's dancing naked to the song Goodbye Horses by Q Lazarus, that scene is so creepy, yet oddly mesmerizing at the same time, maybe just because the song Goodbye Horses is just so ethereal. Now, I know that song existed before this movie, but that song's probably gonna be forever known as the Silence of the Lambs song. You also have Frankie Faison as Barney the Orderly. What's interesting is Faison actually was in Manhunter as a different character. You also have Cassie Lemons as Clarice's friend, whose name escapes me at the moment, but she would go on to be in Candyman. You also have Charles Napier as one of the cops who is supposed to be guarding Lecter when he's in that holding cell. You also have some interesting cameos in the movie, including one from B-movie filmmaker Roger Corman. In the movie he plays, I think he's supposed to be like the head of the FBI, like he's Jack Crawford's superior. And then you have a blink and you'll miss it cameo from George A. Romero. Yes, the George Romero makes a brief appearance in this movie as a security guard. But yeah, it's a great movie. In a way, there's really not much else to say about Silence of the Lambs that hasn't already been said. It's a classic for a reason. I will say I do personally prefer Manhunter, which is weird because when it comes to the books, I like the book Silence of the Lambs better than the book Red Dragon, but when it comes to the movies, even though I will acknowledge Silence of the Lambs is technically the superior film, I do find myself rewatching Manhunter way more often, but that's also not taken away from Silence of the Lambs. And much like the book, the movie has had accusations of transphobia and even homophobia because of its portrayal of Buffalo Bill. Much like the book, it's one of those deals where I don't don't think there was any intentional bigotry on the filmmaker's part, but it's one of those deals where it is somewhat a product of its time. But I know the film actually did have some protesters at the Academy Awards. You also had Howard Shore's score for the movie, which is fantastic. But again, it's a great movie. I cannot recommend Silence of the Lambs enough, especially if you did read the book. It is a perfect adaptation of the novel. And there's so much from the movie that has wormed its way into pop culture. Everybody knows the line, "It rubs the lotion on its skin or else it gets the hose again," or "I ate his liver with fava beans and a nice Chianti." The movie also has one of the most misquoted lines in pop culture. "Good evening, Clarice" is the actual line, yet somehow in pop culture everybody remembers it as "Hello, Clarice," even though Hannibal never once says "Hello, Clarice" in the whole movie. Somehow that line has become one of the most iconic lines in popular culture. And even though it's debatable whether Silence of the Lambs could count as a full-fledged horror film or not, Hannibal Lecter would end up becoming sort of a horror movie icon, with many people ranking him right alongside the likes of Freddy Krueger, Jason, Michael Myers, and Chucky. The movie's also been parodied multiple times, from Billy Crystal's spoof in the movie at the Academy Awards to Saturday Night Live. There was a parody film called Silence of the Hams. It was heavily parodied in Loaded Weapon. It's been spoofed on Robot Chicken and Family Guy. One of my favorite parodies of the film is in Clerks 2, where Jay and Silent Bob start dancing to Goodbye Horses in an obvious nod to Silence of the Lambs. There was also a musical parody on the film as well. I also think so many later serial killer-themed crime dramas and horror films owe something to Silence of the Lambs, like David Fincher's Seven, and even the Saw movies, and movies like Longlegs, as well as shows like True Detective, and even The X-Files to a certain degree. In fact, I believe Chris Carter has said that Clarice Starling was a direct inspiration for Dana Scully on The X-Files. There was even a Batman comic by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale that was clearly inspired by Silence of the Lambs, called The Long Halloween, in which Batman is tracking a serial killer who is killing mobsters on holidays, and in order to get clues and help on how to catch this serial killer, he goes to see another serial killer who is locked away in Arkham Asylum called the Calendar Man, and you can tell that the Calendar Man is basically meant to be a stand-in for Hannibal Lecter. Now I want to cut to my friend Mark Allan Gunnells giving his thoughts on the movie version of Silence of the Lambs.
It was a phenomenal adaptation. It was so faithful to the book, so much dialogue lifted right out. It followed the plot. You know, it had to cut and condense things for time, obviously, but you really were seeing the novel put on screen. And the performances were amazing, especially Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins. They had wonderful chemistry together. All their scenes together were so tense, were so fun to watch, because those two actors were really at the top of their game, playing off each other. And the ending was so well done, so well orchestrated. So I think it's one of the best film adaptations I've ever seen.
Now I want to cut to my friend Bill Burns giving his thoughts on the movie Silence of the Lambs. Now, he has read the book, but he's admitted that he read the book a long time ago, and he remembers more of the movie than he does the book. Now, before I ask you about Silence of the Lambs, what are your thoughts on Michael Mann's Manhunter, and have you read Red Dragon, which is the first of the Hannibal Lecter series?
Yes, I did read Red Dragon, but I read it after The Silence of the Lambs. To be honest, I don't even remember if I knew it even existed until after The Silence of the Lambs. And that's the same thing with Michael Mann's Manhunter, because I think when I saw it, it was on TV. It was like after Silence of the Lambs came out, they called it like Red Dragon, the origin of, they changed the title of it to run it on TV, you know? So of course I watched it because I was a big fan of Silence of the Lambs, and I loved it. I was surprised at how much I enjoyed the film. Very different, totally different sort of aesthetic, totally different approach than Jonathan Demme does for the Silence of the Lambs, but I thought it was great. I thought it was very compelling. I thought William Peterson was great. Just great performances in the film. I love, what's his name? The plays Dollarhide.
Oh, Tom Noonan.
Yeah, Tom Noonan was awesome, which I already liked him from other films I'd seen him in. So yeah, I enjoyed it a lot, you know, but very different. Like, you know, I think that stylistically, I would probably give it to Manhunter, but Silence of the Lambs, I think, at least the film at least, has that extra layer of critique that I don't see as strongly in Manhunter, you know. And then I remember reading a really interesting article about Manhunter in the Video Watchdog, which was like this fanzine that came out it was in the 90s, and it kind of looked at, you know, like the horror films, you know, sort of cult films in a really sort of academic way. And one of the things that they brought up in an article was that there was multiple cuts to the film, talking about the different cuts and what has changed. So that even made me even more interested in the film. And then I remember, I think Anchor Bay might have put it out on DVD, and they included a totally different cut from the other two cuts that were out there, you know? So I've been really fascinated by Michael Mann's Manhunter. I even heard a rumor that he's going back, just like he went back to The Keep and actually did a new, you know, remastered The Keep or whatever, that he's going to do a sort of a definitive cut of Manhunter. So hopefully that'll come out.
Now, before you talk about the movie Silence of the Lambs, you've mentioned that you read the book. How much do you remember of the book?
Well, to be honest, I read the book around the time when the film came out, so I think I saw the film first and then read the book. But I enjoyed the book very much. I did. I thought that I really liked the fact that, you know, it was through the perspective of Clarice, the book, as well as the movie. So I thought that was a good thing that Jonathan Demme sort of ported over. Yeah, I really liked the book. I thought it was really good. It was, you know, a good page turner. Although I'm thinking about it, I think I might like Red Dragon better in some ways, in terms of the story and the narrative, you know. But yeah, I enjoyed the book very much. So, I mean, at the time, it was a big phenomenon in culture. You know, I think I was like maybe, 18, 19 years old, I guess, when it came out. So, you know, it was a big phenomenon. So, like, I read the book, I saw the movie, you know. So I was very much into the whole sort of, like, mythos of that universe.
So what are your thoughts on Jonathan Demme's Silence of the Lambs?
Well, it's funny. Like, I know we've talked in the past about how sometimes a director can take a sort of the source narrative and sort of build on it, and sometimes even improve it in adding visuals to it, editing, sort of, you know, what is used through cinema. And, you know, we've talked about, like, you know, The Shining, right, about Kubrick versus King, Jaws, right, Benchley versus Spielberg's version. And this is another example, in my opinion, where I think that the director sort of elevated the material. Even though the material is good, like in Thomas Harris's novel is great, I really think that Demme took that source material and made it into this whole critique of the male gaze, of patriarchy, of misogyny, and really just took it to that other level. There's so much of the film is about Clarice being this victim of the male gaze, right? And she gets the gaze from not only the good guys, not only the bad guys, but also from the good guys too, right? And if you think about it, in the film, at some point, every male character in the film stares at Clarice. Sort of evaluates her, sort of, you know, judges her, right? And we see this through the use of close-ups and point of view, right, and POV, right? We're constantly put in Clarice's place, right? And we get her perspective because the male characters stare at us just as much as they stare at Clarice, right? And we get that through, like you said, camera placement, shot sequences, shot choice, you know? And again, it's Demme's brilliance to do that, you know? I mean, again, I agree that in the original novel, there is definitely that sort of layer of, okay, you know, Clarice having to face misogyny, having to face patriarchy, you know? But to see it and to be put in that perspective, right? That to me is brilliant. For me, I enjoy it more than I do the novel. And again, right, I think the other thing too is that, you know, in most Hollywood films, the audience is forced to identify with the male hero, right? And in this one of the few films up to this point where you're sort of forced to sort of identify with Clarice, right, as with a female protagonist rather than with the male protagonist. One of the antagonists, right, is this person who is questioning their identity, right? So part of the movie, and I guess part of the book, but especially in the movie, right, is questioning, well, what is a woman? What is a man, right? And if you think about it, all the male characters in the film are constantly questioning Clarice. They're constantly questioning her sexuality, her availability, her authority, her knowledge, her aptitude. And these questions are insulting, they're harassing, they're belittling, they ridicule her, right?
Oh yeah, especially like some of the stuff Dr. Chilton says to her.
Yeah, right. Why is she questioned? Because she's a woman and she's seen as a second-class citizen in patriarchal society, right? So she's constantly questioned, like, you know, you're a woman, you're lesser, you're a second-class citizen, therefore you have to justify why you're an FBI agent. You have to justify why you're in a position of authority. You have to justify why you're on this case, you know? And I think that gets the audience thinking about, well, you know, do we do that to women in our society? Why do we question women? Why do we evaluate and judge women so much, you know? And again, Demi does it brilliantly in the film.
But one thing I will say, like, about the character of Jack Crawford, and yeah, Crawford does have that comment when they're in the funeral home where he says to the sheriff, I don't know if it's a good idea to be discussing a sex crime like this in front of a woman, and he's like signaling to Clarice when he says that. And to be fair, later on he does apologize to Clarice and say, hey look, I was just trying to get them out of our hair. But she does call him on it. She's like, it matters, you know, and I thought that was actually a pretty important scene. But the thing I do like about Jack Crawford in both the book and the movie, more so in the book, he does have her back throughout the entire story, which is something I do really like about the Jack Crawford character, even though you would think he would be a little more old school.
Well, but again, like, how does Clarice get involved in the case? Right? Doesn't he send, Crawford is a manipulator. He sends her to go talk to Hannibal Lecter, right?
Yeah.
Why didn't he send a male? So again, I agree. I don't think he's as misogynistic and as sort of patriarchal and chauvinistic as some of the other characters in, but he does display those things. And I think Harris and Demi are trying to say is that men in our society, no matter how much we want to deny that we're sexist, we're this, if we're born into a patriarchal society, those things are going to be imprinted on you. You don't even know that you're doing it, you know what I mean? But they will be imprinted on you, you know? And I think the other thing too is you see in the film, which I think is brilliant, especially in terms of Demi's version, is if Clarice was the only woman who was ridiculed, who was only the woman who was judged and evaluated and made to feel lesser than, then you could say, well, they just have a problem with Clarice, right? That there's some weakness in her character, or there's something that they see in her, right? But think about how many of the female characters in the film are also denigrated, or also embarrassed, or also humiliated, right? And again, we see it, not only does this happen through the interactions with other characters, but even like little cues in the film, right? When the senator's daughter's driving a car and she's singing the song "American Girl" by Tom Petty, right? Yeah. And like the line is, you know, you're an American girl raised on promises. So as if like, you know, all you care about is a fantasy or promises. Like you weren't raised on reality, right? You were raised on promises, hope, like, you know what I mean? That, and sometimes that sort of disintegrates. Also, there's that one scene where Clarice is in the bedroom of Buffalo Bill's first victim, I think. Yeah. And in the background, you see a poster, and I think it's from Blondie, and it says Deaf, Dumb, and Blonde. So again, right, it's just brilliant the way how misogyny and chauvinism are imprinted in our culture.
What do you think of Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter, especially compared to Brian Cox in Manhunter?
Again, very different portrayals. I actually think that Brian Cox's portrayal is more naturalistic, is more kind of realistic, I guess I could say, you know? Anthony Hopkins plays up the whole villainy and the whole sort of, it became a kind of a stereo. I think that was really created the stereotype of the sort of, the hyper sort of intelligent, but very cold and calculating serial killer. But they're both great. I mean, obviously, Anthony Hopkins became iconic in that role, But I think I like Brian Cox's better. I think he's like a little bit more sly, a little bit more like, cutting in his comments and things, And he seems more realistic to me, I guess.
What do you think of some of the accusations that both the book and the movie had of transphobia?
I don't see it at all, to be honest. Because again, Buffalo Bill is a psychopath and he's a misogynist, right? Buffalo Bill hates himself, right? I think at one point even Hannibal Lecter says that, right? So think about it. What is the ultimate in self-loathing? To turn yourself into the thing that you hate, right? So if he's a misogynist, right? If he already hates women and has the self-loathing, right? So wouldn't that be the ultimate in self-nihilism, right? To turn yourself into the very thing that you hate, right? And again, he's not turning himself into this other gender because he feels naturally that, that he was born in the wrong body, or that he's this other, he was born, in some ways with the wrong identity, right? He's doing it out of that's his pathology, right? So he's not doing it out of anything that is reasoned or anything that is comes from a good place. He's doing it coming from this psychotic place, right? He's doing it from this sort of psychopathic place. So again, he's not a transsexual, right? He isn't in the film, right? That's one of the points of the film, is he isn't a transsexual, right? He's a psychopath who has such self-loathing, he's going to turn himself into the thing that he hates the most. So one of the things I really think is really, truly brilliant and really so insightful, and it really got me thinking so much after seeing the film, is Jonathan Demme's sort of critique of theory of, like, where do serial killers come from, right? Because I think often in our society, we believe that serial killers are the outcasts. They're the outliers, right? They're the exact opposite of society's ideals and values, right? Well, if a society encourages men to objectify women, if a society encourages men to think that violence against women is okay, to objectify women, to see them as second-class citizens, to see them as weaker, to see them as lesser than, then obviously the natural product of that society is going to be serial killers, right? It's the natural product of a society that says that women are lesser than, are nothing, are going to be men who prey upon women. So that's what I thought was really interesting, is that the serial killer is not the outcast. The serial killer is not the outlier in patriarchal society. The serial killer is at the heart, right? It's at the heart of patriarchal society, right? Because if you tell men that women, it's okay to use and abuse women, that's what they're going to do. You know, so I thought that was really brilliant. I thought that was the first time I ever saw that, because in most serial killer movies or novels, TV shows that I had seen, right, the serial killer is always this sort of monster out there, an outcast on the outer layer of society, you know, that is sort of is the exact opposite of society's values and ideals. Jonathan Demme flips that, right, and says, no, listen, if we live in a patriarchal society that objectifies women, well, you're going to get people who are going to take that to the extreme, you know, and that's what I thought. That's why I really thought the movie was brilliant.
Now, in 1999, Thomas Harris released a third novel in the Hannibal Lecter saga, simply titled Hannibal, which continued both Clarice and Hannibal Lecter's story. Now, despite Stephen King at the time calling it the best horror novel since William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist, the book was actually highly divisive when it came out. A lot of people were very disappointed with the third novel, especially with the ending, which I know pissed off Jodie Foster of all people, who thought that the ending of the third book was kind of a betrayal of the Clarice Starling character. Now, I actually do like Hannibal. I actually think it's a pretty good book. I understand why the book pissed so many people off at the time, but I kind of appreciate just how unapologetically weird that novel is, and while I understand why people hated the ending so much, I also appreciate that Thomas Harris kind of had the balls to go there, if you know what I mean. But I am planning on eventually rereading that book and doing another review of it, so more of my thoughts on that to come. Now, Hannibal was adapted 2 years later by Ridley Scott, and I actually do like the movie, even though I know that was very polarizing as well. Now, because Jodie Foster hated the book, they couldn't get her back as Clarice, so this time Clarice is played by Julianne Moore, who I don't think did a bad job, but it would have been so much better if they could have gotten Jodie Foster back. It really would have. And of course, Anthony Hopkins reprised the role of Hannibal Lecter, but he was a lot more cartoonish this time around. In 2002, there was another adaptation of Red Dragon, this one made specifically to tie in more with the Anthony Hopkins Hannibal films, making it simultaneously a remake of Manhunter and a prequel to The Silence of the Lambs, and I'll be honest, I'm not a fan of the 2002 Red Dragon. I'm really not. I find it to be a painfully bland, mediocre film, and it is a lot closer to the book than Manhunter was, but this is one of those cases where being closer to the source material doesn't always make it a better film. I think Manhunter is a vastly superior film, and I know the 2002 Red Dragon has its fans, but I'm not crazy about it, I'm really not. Now, in 2006, Thomas Harris released a prequel novel called Hannibal Rising, which was adapted into the movie of the same name in 2007. Now, I never read the book, but I actually do like the movie Hannibal Rising, and I know I'm in a very, very small minority when it comes to that. Now, between 2013 and 2015, we had the NBC series Hannibal, created by Bryan Fuller, which was sort of this grand reimagining of the entire Thomas Harris Hannibal Lecter universe. But whereas the books were relatively reality-based, the show went for a more surreal tone and atmosphere, and it even had a subtle supernatural undercurrent. Now, I enjoyed the show quite a bit. It wasn't perfect, especially the first season kinda became serial killer of the week, and as the show went on, some of the twists and turns got a little preposterous, but then again, some people say the same things about the later Thomas Harris books. But the best thing about the show, in my opinion, was the relationship between Will Graham and Hannibal Lecter. They had a very complicated and complex relationship on that show, and I thought a lot of that was done brilliantly. Now, in the show, Hannibal Lecter was played by Mads Mikkelsen, and my god, I really do go back and forth on who is my favorite Hannibal Lecter. Sometimes I say Brian Cox in Manhunter, sometimes I say Anthony Hopkins, but a lot of the times my brain kind of goes to Mads Mikkelsen. I actually think Mads Mikkelsen, if I really think about it, he might actually be the best Dr. Lecter. Now, the show obviously owes a lot more to Red Dragon and Manhunter than it does to Silence of the Lambs, but there is a subplot on the show about Jack Crawford's wife dying of cancer, which was obviously taken directly from the book Silence of the Lambs. Now, they do eventually adapt to Red Dragon for the third season, but Bryan Fuller had initially planned on eventually bringing Clarice Starling into the show, and he had wanted to adapt Silence of the Lambs for the fourth season, and dear God, I wish that could have happened. It would have been very interesting to see how the show would have handled Clarice Starling, and it also would have been really interesting, especially with Bryan Fuller being a gay man. It would have been really fascinating to see how the show would have done the whole Buffalo Bill storyline. Like, would Bryan Fuller have approached the subject matter a little more tactfully than Thomas Harris and Jonathan Demme did? Would he have made Buffalo Bill a more tragic character? Unfortunately, we'll never know because the show was cancelled after its third season, but already, for copyright reasons, they couldn't actually use Clarice or Buffalo Bill, but there was actually a Clarice TV series in, I want to say 2021. It had nothing to do with the Bryan Fuller Hannibal series, and it was ostensibly set between Silence of the Lambs and Hannibal. Now, in the show, Clarice was played by Rebecca Breeds. I have not seen a single episode of the show, so I really can't say how she did one way or the other. Buffalo Bill does also appear on the show, I'm guessing in flashbacks or something, and on the show he was played by Simon Northwood. Unfortunately, from everything I heard about the show, it sounds like it really is your standard run-of-the-mill police procedural. It just happens to feature Clarice Starling as the main protagonist. Also, for the same reason that Bryan Fuller could not use Clarice on Hannibal, the show Clarice could not actually mention Hannibal Lecter for copyright reasons, which is really bizarre when you think about it.
And here is Bill again giving his thoughts on the Hannibal TV series.
But what are your thoughts on the TV series?
I love the TV series. It was one of my favorite shows when it was on. I just thought that the mix of just the elegance and the brutality of the show were brilliant. It was like beautiful and it was ugly at the same time. I thought Mads Mikkelsen was amazing. I thought he was great. He's, to me, I actually think that he might be my favorite Hannibal Lecter out of all the Hannibal Lecters that I've seen. Him first, Brian Cox second, and Anthony Hopkins third. But I thought it was great, and I really liked the way that Bryan Fuller kind of sort of like threaded through the mythos of, you know, Thomas Harris's mythos, but also added his own kind of things to it too. You know, Will Graham, was Hugh Darby, right? I think he played Will Graham. He was great. Lawrence Fishburne. How they even threaded through like Red Dragon into it as well. And I heard that they were actually going to do Silence of the Lambs next, but the show got canceled. But I loved the show. I thought it was beautiful, but it was also brutal. It was like Mads Mikkelsen's performance he was so erudite and so sophisticated, you know what I mean? And at the same time, he's this absolutely savage, brutal killer at the same time. I thought was brilliant. And I love the interplay between Will Graham and Hannibal in the film, in the TV series. And I thought the ending was great. I know a lot of people didn't like the ending, but I didn't see any other way that it could end. They were so entangled in each other that, of course, they had to destroy each other. But I loved it. I loved the show. I really enjoyed it. And also, for a network show at that time, it really pushed a lot of boundaries in terms of like violence, in terms of the savagery of the show, which just, was amazing. But yeah, I loved it. I loved the show.
So yeah, that was my review of The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris, and bye.